This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Monday, February the 12th, 2024, day after Super Bowl, which is supposed to be a sporting event, although it increasingly seemed as if it was an event for and by celebrities. It's almost as if Beverly Hills went to Las Vegas, or Las Vegas became Beverly Hills. We all got, I'm sure, rather tired of images of Taylor Swift and Elon Musk. Everybody seems to be there. Beyonce and Jay-Z, Usher and Alicia Keys, who performed at the halftime show, Kim Kardashian, of course, a ubiquitous Beverly Hills style celebrity, Gwen Stefani and Blake Shelton. Everyone was there except, of course, myself. Celebrity has always been central, it seems, to the American identity, the American economy, American culture. And sometimes that celebrity is a little bit more dangerous and troubling than perhaps the celebrity and celebrities on show at the Super Bowl yesterday. My guest today has a new book out. It's not about the Super Bowl. It's about real-time spying, Beverly Hills Spy, and it deals with a 20th century celebrity. If he was around today, I think the celebrity probably would have been front and center of many cameras at the Super Bowl. Ronald Drabkin has this new book out. As I said, it's called Beverly Hills Spy, and he's joining us. He's on the road somewhere between Los Angeles and California. Ronald, welcome. Congratulations on the new book. It's out tomorrow. It's already getting great reviews. Kirkus starred it. Ronald, have you always been interested in celebrity? I know you're interested in spying, and we'll get to that. But what is it about celebrities that seem to make it so essential to the American identity and the American cultural economy?
Yeah, I maybe have a slightly unique perspective on that. I grew up with a lot of celebrity kids out in Los Angeles, and so it was always kind of around. And I never felt it to be very interesting myself, perhaps, but it was just everywhere, and people seemed to be drawn to it as a evergreen kind of thing.
So, did you grow up in Beverly Hills yourself? You were a Beverly Hills, not a spy, but a kid?
I grew up just outside, yes, and no, I was certainly not in espionage, but my father was, so that was a lot of the relevant background.
We'll get to your dad later. Everybody, of course, has heard of the Kardashians. Most people, including myself, haven't heard of the central character in your new book, Beverly Hills Spy, Frederick Rutland. Tell us about him and how you learned about him.
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure of the early 20th century. So he's well known now, or becoming well known now as the head Japanese spy on the west coast of the United States in the run up to Pearl Harbor, with his celebrity contacts and such. But he got there. He's English. And he originally became famous in World War I. He was the first combat naval aviator. So in 1916, there was a very large sea battle between the Germans and the British at a place called Jutland. There was on one side 99 German ships, and on the other side was 150 British ships and one airplane. And that one airplane was piloted by this fellow, Frederick Rutland, who as a result of his excellence, he became the one pilot selected by the British Royal Navy to do the first combat carrier mission.
Yeah, he was known as Rutland of Jutland, appropriately enough, given his heroic role. So I guess, in a sense, could one think of him as the British Lindbergh?
Yeah, I think that's actually quite a fair. Hadn't thought of that, Andrew, but yeah, that's actually quite good. Yeah.
Charles Lindbergh, of course, another famous pilot, although perhaps in some ways less heroic than Frederick Rutland. So It was a man of enormous bravery, fought
Mhm.
the German, the German, not the army, but certainly the German air fleet single-handedly in World War One, and lived to survive. He was known as Rutland of Jutland. So how did he, before we get to the spying, how did he get to America?
Yeah, it's fairly simply, he had become an advisor to the Japanese Navy right after World War One, and around between the wars, the aircraft technology was advancing very, very rapidly. So if you go back to about 1930, the navies they have carriers now, but they're still flying these biplanes, these wooden canvas biplanes. They're going maybe 150 miles an hour. And it was very clear what was happening is the technology is moving very quickly. Within a few years, there were the all aluminum monoplanes with very large engines. So, everyone's familiar with American P-51 Mustang, the British Spitfire, or the Japanese Zero. And these were coming quickly. And the Japanese were very interested in getting the latest in the aircraft technology. And with the U.S. being the leader, one of them approached Mr. Rutland in London. He was there. He was working for his brother-in-law's company and was bored to tears. And they said, "We're looking for someone to help us with aircraft technology, and you've always helped us before. You've been wonderful, and we'd like you to go to America because that's where we need the most information."
So did the Japanese recruit him? I mean, he turned into a spy, but did they recruit him as a spy initially, or was he recruited as a technical consultant who later became a spy?
Yeah, I think it's Andrew, it's a gray line there, right? But yes, he was initially a technical consultant.
And so he went from this war hero, First World War hero, went from the UK to where? To California.
Yeah, and they put him in Hollywood, and there was a good reason for that. Hollywood, Los Angeles area had basically everything the Japanese Navy was interested in. 70% of U.S. aircraft production, not all, other than Boeing, almost all the new aircraft development was there. Lockheed and Douglas come up very frequently. And the U.S. Pacific Fleet was there. The American ships moved to Pearl Harbor, where they were eventually attacked by the Japanese Navy. But at this time, they were in Los Angeles, in the Long Beach Harbor.
We've done some shows actually on US-Japanese relations in the 20s and 30s. It still remains quite controversial.
Mm-hmm.
So initially, presumably, Rutland's association with the Japanese was quite uncontroversial in the 20s, even if he'd been quote unquote a spy or a technical consultant, political consultant.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have been that controversial, would it, in the 20s? Had it become known publicly?
Well, the Japanese did a very well. I wouldn't say it's the most clever bit of subterfuge, but they hired him in name. He was a consultant to the Mitsubishi company. Okay, and so the British folks found that a little troubling, but not overly troubling. But he wasn't. He was working directly for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the British never found this out. They never knew. What the Japanese did is they installed him at a house near the beach in a place called Zushi, which is quite close to the main Japanese naval base in Yokosuka. It's where the Japanese admirals lived then and live today, right over the hill. And at that time, the Japanese were updating their aircraft carriers, which weren't working very well. The Akagi and the Kaga were the two lead carriers in the Pearl Harbor attack. And basically, the Japanese sailors would go over to his house. They'd walk over a couple times a week. They would do it in plainclothes and get advice on how to update their carriers. So if the British had found that out, I think there would have been a lot more problems.
But he was living in the US, and then he went to Japan. I mean, what's it got
Yeah.
to do with the British?
Yeah. Well, initially his technology was all from Britain, right? So he had, been a Royal Navy veteran.
Was he? Was he? And there were many ex-servicemen out of the First World War who
Yeah.
were like this. Was he? And Hitler, of course, is the best example, I guess, not
Mhm.
obviously the British, but of the German army. Was he? Did the First World War make him profoundly disillusioned and cynical? Did it have a profound impact on him?
I would say it was probably the opposite. He loved the glory. He's famous in the newspapers. He's audiences with the king. He was a low-born fellow from a working class family, and he's meeting the king. He's meeting the admirals are confiding in him. I think he really loved it.
But if he did, then to become a spy, to
Yeah.
inform on your own country and your own side, what what drove that? Was it just material interest? Was he available to the highest bidder?
I think there was obviously he was very, very financially motivated, and the Japanese offered him a lot of money. The other thing that comes out in the source documentation is he felt discriminated against because of his class. There's the commentary that your wartime hero is not good for a peacetime military. And he was told fairly directly that in the post-war Royal Air Force, he was not going to have a bright future. And he perceived that to be because of his class.
Oddly enough, he's the reverse of many of the upper class spies of the 30s and 40s who were working for the Russians.
Yeah.
Philby comes to mind in particular. So
Yeah.
he was a working class boy. He never went to university.
Yep.
What were his politics as a member of the working class? Was he a supporter of labor, of socialism?
He never talked about that. I've never seen any documentation on that, but I don't think he was a socialist or anything. He was, a practical pilot, engineer, war hero who really enjoyed being in the action.
And he was, of course, in the action, not just in the air during the First World War, but in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills. He associated with Amelia Earhart, Charlie Chaplin, Graham Greene's brother. How did he get into that network? Was he simply famous as a war hero from the First World War?
Yeah, and the early Hollywood stars, very, very a lot of British there. You mentioned Chaplin and Karloff, and there's plenty of others. Nigel Bruce and Basil Rathbone, and a lot of these folks were in Hollywood at the time. They had a lot in common with him, and they had a private club. Called the British United Services Club in Hollywood, where these British actors could go and I don't know what kind of British food they eat, but have their drinks and stay away from the stars.
They probably ate Marmite, did they?
I would assume it was something like that.
Probably something slightly stronger than that. So he became part of this British expat club with guys like Charlie Chaplin. It was quite an achievement. And was this as a consequence or independent of his spying? Did they go together, or did he lead these parallel lives?
It really went closely together. He told the Japanese at one point, he said a lot of things that he never actually did, but he said, look, there's going to be a war between the US and Japan at some point.
Yeah, he said that about in the mid-30s. So he was one of the first people to actually understand that.
Yeah, and it was, it seemed obvious to him, and what he said is, look, you have a hard time spying in the U.S. anyway. There's a color line back then, right, where a Japanese face would not be admitted into. The Russians had a lot easier time recruiting spies, right? Just ideological people. But yeah, so he's recruited in, and he says to them, look, when the war starts, you're not going to have any other agents in the U.S. Your own consulates will be closed, your embassies will be closed. You're going to need information. And what could be better than a bunch of Brits of, America's new ally?
When did he say that, Ronald?
He said that to the Japanese at this time in the early 30s.
But even the Japanese in the early 30s, there was no inevitability of war. Did he just sense it in his bones, or was he speaking metaphorically?
He was obviously trying to inflate his own value. There's no question about that. But one of the things that I've done, doing the research in the U.S. and Japan, the common historical consensus is that the Japanese Navy didn't want war with the U.S. War was not inevitable. And a lot of the initial source documentations you find in Japanese do not tell that picture. They tell a lot about the Japanese Navy, even from the earliest days, saying, "Look, this is our potential enemy," and a lot of them were very excited to get into a fight with America.
We are speaking with Ronald Drabkin, who lives in Japan, who grew up in Los Angeles, talking to us from California, author of an intriguing new book, Beverly Hills Spy, about a British First World War pilot, a hero who fought off the German Air Force, who became a Japanese spy during the 1930s. I want to remind everyone.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas, it's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
It is indeed invaluable, and you can subscribe to Liberties at Liberties Journal or libertiesquarterly.com. Frederick Rutland was invaluable to the Japanese, I think, at least, according to Ronald Drabkin. How essential was he, Ronald, in terms of their intelligence and their decision to declare war and bomb Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, there's several layers. Some things we don't know, a few things we do. The Japanese diaries that we found in memoirs of the admirals said that he was profoundly helpful in actually creating the first Japanese carrier strike force and its initial evaluation. We also know that the Japanese planes evolved very quickly in the 1930s, and we know that it's firmly documented how much he stole in information from Lockheed and from Douglas and even from Boeing. And it's also documented that the engineers from the Japanese aircraft companies actually came to the US to meet with him. So there is all that. And the other thing that's fairly new information is that they sent him to Pearl Harbor quite a bit. There's even one story. In 1939, he takes his daughter with him to Japan. They meet the Japanese Admiralty, and on the way back, they spend a week in Hawaii. And his daughter goes to the beach, and he goes and talks to the folks at Pearl Harbor.
And yet, he wasn't executed. I mean, in some senses, one would have guessed that once all this came to light, once Pearl Harbor was bombed, he would have been treated as the worst kind of traitor. So what happened once Pearl Harbor was bombed?
Yeah, so he was the biggest problem was he was embarrassing. He was embarrassing to the FBI. He was embarrassing to the U.S. and he was very, very embarrassing to the British. And right before Pearl Harbor, he had been sent back to England to try to keep him quiet. There's the FBI documents and the State Department documents say, look, for all these Japanese spies, for God's sake, keep them out of the news. We don't want this out there, right? A few days.
It was so embarrassing about how much they actually reveal.
Yeah, he's operating in plain sight, hanging out with Charlie Chaplin, for 8 or 9 years, and no one figures this out. It's extremely embarrassing to the British because they never mentioned this to the Americans, right? The Brits were busy trying to get the Americans to come into the war themselves. Bless you, and and they're like, well, how do we bring this up? There's MI6 documents saying, how do we bring this up with the Americans that, he's been here working.
And the guy they should have brought it out with, who would have been embarrassed, he had many embarrassing secrets, was J. Edgar Hoover. How was he involved? And did he miss all the signals? He missed a lot of signals in the 30s.
He missed a lot of signals, and this was certainly one of them. He didn't trust this fellow and had him, removed from the scene. So, Rutland made a very credible case, I think, to the FBI. There's been many, signals that have come up that have been were revealed to the FBI over the last, 10, 20 years. But this was a very credible witness, right? This is someone who says, look, I've been working with the Japanese Admiralty for 20 years. My good friends I made in the Japanese Navy in the 20s are now running the Japanese Navy. And I know exactly what they're up to. They don't tell me everything, but if they're going to attack, I will know and I will tell you. And this was ignored, right? This warning was ignored, and Hoover definitely had this all covered up. It's very clear in the FBI documents, which say, there was one time when one of the FBI agents mentioned Rutland in some forum, and he got a nasty letter saying, "Look, yes, you're quoting a figure that is true, but do not mention this to anyone outside the FBI to prevent embarrassment to the agency." So it's clear.
Perhaps it could be explained by J. Edgar Hoover's obsessive anti-communism. Conceivably, I guess, what many people consider his homosexuality, and his also obsession with race, which obviously African American identity, which I guess doesn't really touch on this. So he so to speak, Rutland slipped under J. Edgar Hoover's radar.
Yeah, you could say he was just ignored or not believed, or you could just say, Hoover really didn't have Japan on his radar very much. He was obsessed with communists, socialists, African Americans, lots of bootleggers, right? Japan wasn't as much on the FBI's radar, at least for quite a while.
How much, in your view, does your book reveal the rather this episode as a shameful period in American intelligence, and particularly the FBI? There was, of course, no CIA back then.
Right. Yeah. The discoordination between the U.S. intelligence agencies is very clear. Right. The FBI says this, the Navy says that, the State Department says this. They're all going in different directions, and they're not really talking with the British intelligence agencies either. And to your point, Andrew, the CIA was created after this time, and the point of the CIA was it's a central intelligence agency, right? To prevent lack of coordination. And some of the folks that are the folks on the back cover of the book who endorsed it, retired U.S. naval intelligence folks have pointed out very clearly that 9/11 happened, and it was very similar, right? 9/11, there were clues all over the place that were not put together, and it may be an issue today where there's clues different places and to threats to the U.S. and to the West that are not together.
Were there, in your view at least, might there have been Japanese spies within the FBI or within the senior people within the American government?
There were not. I actually, one of we found the ex-head of one of the ex-heads of the Japanese Navy. We found his diaries, and he gives a list of every spy he has in the U.S. And they weren't really that good at it. There was one at the Library of Congress.
So they were amateurs on both sides. J. Edgar Hoover, who missed all the signals, and the Japanese, who were rather blithe too.
Yeah, their intelligence were not very good. Yeah.
So then what happened? So Pearl Harbor happened.
Yeah.
He got sent back. Was he put in jail? Was he interrogated?
Yeah. Yeah. There was a British law at the time that allowed suspended habeas corpus. And basically any enemy of Britain could be jailed without trial. And he was one of those folks. So a few days after the Pearl Harbor raid and Britain U.S. enters the war, knock on the door, a couple constables, and they take him to Brixton Prison, and they let him rot away there with with all the British fascists and the British Nazi Party people and such.
So was he publicly disgraced, or he became simply someone that disappeared?
The British intelligence folks did try to keep it quiet, but it definitely got out. Some of his friends from the Royal Navy were trying to get him out of jail and were giving speeches to that effect. So, yes, he was disgraced, but he also had a strong argument that he was innocent, according to him.
You've written this book. It's the first serious book on the subject. Is it an attempt to rehabilitate him? What are you saying that will surprise other historians of the period?
I'm not going to say he was a good man. He was definitely a bad fellow. He definitely betrayed his own country and did a lot of damage to the U.S. But it is complicated. There's strong arguments that a lot of the stuff he did was not illegal. A lot of intelligence gathering, today is not. And yeah, I don't want to rehabilitate him. I wouldn't say that would be the right thing to do. Yeah.
Are there any warnings in the book in the 30s about celebrity and the cult of celebrity? We began this show talking about the cult of celebrity that was definitely on show at the Super Bowl yesterday.
Yeah. I think the British celebrities in Hollywood come across quite well in this book.
You mean the Chaplins of the world?
Yeah, I don't have evidence of Chaplin, but I definitely Boris Karloff is all over the FBI files. The redacted parts of the FBI files may contain Chaplin, but I don't have evidence of that. But these British actors went to the FBI and they said, "Look, we suspect there's something wrong here," and they brought the FBI into the picture here.
I mentioned Lindbergh earlier, suggesting that he might be the British version. Lindbergh, of course, became associated with America First. Did Rutland ever meet Lindbergh? Did he have any connection with him?
I don't believe so. He met a lot of people, but that would be one no.
And was he involved in any way in American politics, in the American First movement, in isolationism? What were his and of course with FDR? I assume if you'd have mentioned the name of Frederick Rutland to FDR, would that have rung a bell? Would he have ever heard his name?
You're asking Andrew some strange questions, things I've never even never thought of, really. Yes, I would. Yeah, Roosevelt was a Navy guy, and Rutland was the most famous naval aviator of the First War, so he would have known him for sure.
But he wasn't familiar with Rutland as a spy.
It probably didn't make it up to the president, I would assume. It did make it up to Churchill. That came up a lot.
Oh, Churchill. Well, if Churchill knew, then presumably FDR would have known.
Yeah, I mean,
wasn't it? Wouldn't it have been Churchill or the British? The British responsibility to inform their allies of what was happening?
It certainly seemed to be, and they certainly did not. And it went both ways. There's this FBI. There's this one quote from the MI5 files where they say, the FBI returned this fellow to us, and they say they have enough evidence on him to shoot him, right? And then there's the quote below it saying, we think they're being metaphorical here, but we don't know. They're not sharing with us.
It's almost as if it's a mashup of Monty Python and John le Carré.
Yeah, I would say so.
Finally, Ronald, your own personal history is bound up with this. You note that your obsession with espionage history began as a young child in LA when you understood that your own father had been working in counterintelligence. Tell us about that and how this triggered your lifelong interest in espionage.
Yeah, my father was working for military counterintelligence in Los Angeles, slightly later time. But lots and lots of overlap with the Rutland story. Rutland was stealing information from Lockheed. My father was doing counterintelligence at Lockheed.
So your father was on the good side, so to speak. He was working for Americans.
Yeah, well, no, he was. Yeah, I found his manuals and his graduation diplomas, and yes, he was working for U.S. intelligence. So,
and what was he doing?
Chasing communists, basically. He would.
This was after the war.
This was after the war.
And why did that inspire you to write the book and have such an interest in counterintelligence?
When my father passed away, I was just really intrigued, trying to figure out, what he had done, and he had never talked about it. But I was thinking, well, gee, at some point this stuff's going to be declassified. So I wrote into the FBI, and I found a bunch of names of espionage people in Los Angeles in the period, and I wrote in, and this file from Rutland came back, and I was just enthralled by it.
Some people have associated the name James Bond with Rutland, but of course, as le Carré reminds us, there's nothing very romantic, really. It's a rather grubby business. Frederick Rutland was anything but James Bond, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. Well, I mean, he was glamorous. So there is that, but yeah, it's yeah. James Bond would be on the right side, right?
So it's a sad story. It's a tragedy, ultimately. Your Beverly Hills Spy.
It's a tragedy, and there's no good people in it. There's